What's going on? My name is Joey, and I'm the founder of Universal CPA Review.
Okay, so simple enough. We now know who's who, but what do we really need to know for the exam? So there are two primary things that the group engagement team, aka Detective Lucy, is going to need to do for the purposes of this exam as it applies to component auditors. We're going to focus on the planning phase of the engagement and the reporting phase of the engagement. So the exam is primarily going to focus your attention on audit reporting for non-issuers. So that's where we're going to start. And then we'll drill into some of the nuances for reporting on issuers. So as far as the planning phase of the engagement goes, we need to consider, number one, how the group engagement team decides to hire the component auditor. And number two, how to report on a component auditor. And the question you need to ask yourself in that regard is going to be, are we accepting responsibility for the people that we're hiring or not? So let's say that Detective Lucy and Associates is a big 400 accounting firm, auditing clients like Galbraith Dental Clinics who are comprised of multiple subsidiaries all the time. And typically, when they hire a client with multiple subsidiaries, they bring in a component auditor to help them out. Okay, so this is Detective Henry Advisors' big chance, right? They're a smaller firm, and this is their chance to work with a big 400 accounting firm and get some exposure being a part of auditing a bigger client. All right, so this is a big deal for them. But on Detective Lucy's end, she's not very familiar with Detective Henry. They can be kind of sketchy or not do a good job. So in order to make a decision as to whether or not Detective Henry is getting hired, Detective Lucy needs to assess the component auditor by understanding three things. They need to assess the independence of the component auditor and their adherence to relevant ethical standards. They also need to assess the professional competence of the component auditor, right? Can they do the work? And finally, they need to assess their reputation.
You're probably here because you're ready to pass the CPA exams once and for all so that you can advance in your career and move on with your life. Let me be the first to tell you that I've been there and I feel your pain. But I'm also here to tell you that the CPA exam doesn't have to feel like such a maze, and there is a path to a passing score. So what are you waiting for? Don't waste any more time. Commit to the process because it will pay off. In my opinion, I say let's knock out the CPA exams once and for all.
Right, we need to make sure that Detective Henry Advisors has a strong reputation and we can feel comfortable being associated with them. So now that Detective Lucy has made this assessment and we're good to go, Detective Henry has been hired, Detective Lucy and her engagement team will now decide some additional factors. Number one, the degree of involvement of the group engagement team in the component auditor's work. Right, how much of their work are we going to be involved in? Then we need to identify if these components are significant or not. And that is ultimately what's going to dictate how much work the component auditors will really be required to do. Okay, so what you need to know is if the component is considered significant, then that component will need to be audited, whether it's by Detective Lucy's group engagement team or Detective Henry's component auditor team. Now, if the component is not considered significant, then an audit isn't going to need to be performed on this component. Instead, the group engagement team will only need to be required to perform analytical procedures, which are not going to be as heavy in scope. Okay, so that was information related to the planning phase. Now we're going to skip over to the reporting phase of component auditors. And this is really where you need to put a little star down in your notes and listen up, because this is important. So Detective Lucy has done all of this work for the group engagement team. We're ready to issue an opinion on the group financial statements. And the reality is that Detective Henry Advisors was involved, and this should be something that potentially the financial statement readers might need to know about. So a couple of quick hitters before we dive into these two options. Take note that the group auditor is deciding whether or not to make this reference. If we think back on predecessor auditors, right, prior year auditors, we remember that they were the ones making the decision as to whether or not they want to be referenced in the current year report. And then we need to note that when making a decision to reference component auditors, the group engagement team has to ask themselves, do we want to be held responsible? Are we accepting responsibility? Okay, so that's the primary question at hand. So let's start with option one, and that's a situation where the group engagement team assumes full responsibility for the audit of the component. So in this case, Detective Lucy is saying, we are okay with being responsible for the work of the component auditor. But if we're going to be held responsible, we need to make sure that we really know what it is that they did and if they did a good job. So when making this decision to assume responsibility for Detective Henry and the component auditor's work, no reference will need to be made that there was a component auditor used at all. All right, so again, we are accepting responsibility. Basically what this is saying is that we consider Detective Henry effectively part of our team. Right, for all intents and purposes of this engagement, they are staff members of Detective Lucy and Associates. So in this case, no reference is being made, but because they're responsible, they need to determine the type of work to be performed on the financial information of the components and also review the component auditor's work. Right, Detective Henry's work now becomes Detective Lucy's work because they're assuming responsibility. All right, so that was scenario number 1. But what about scenario number 2, where we are not assuming full responsibility? Right, in this case, we're putting our hands up and saying it was them. Detective Henry Advisors is responsible for the audit of Cashco. If there are any mistakes, that's on them. Now, that doesn't mean that Detective Lucy shouldn't be confident that the component auditor is independent, competent, and has a good reputation. Right, they still need to go through the motions when hiring them, but they still have the ability to divide up this responsibility. So if the group engagement team is dividing that responsibility, then reference will need to be made, and it's going to be made in the opinion paragraph. So assuming that this is a non-issuer, they're going to let them know that their opinion is based on their opinion of the group financial statements, which includes the other auditors. Okay, so the group engagement team doesn't need to make reference to Detective Henry Advisors as the component auditor by name, but if the group engagement team is going to do that, then they need to first ask Detective Henry Advisors for permission to make reference of their name. Okay, and one last thing to note in the opinion section is that there's a separate paragraph that is going to be included to disclose the magnitude of the portion of the financial statements audited by the component auditor. So this is how it's going to work. Detective Henry Advisors, the component auditor, is going to perform their work in accordance with GAAP, just as they would if they were auditing any other company. And they're going to provide their audit report to Detective Lucy and Associates, aka the group engagement team. And based on everything that they've received, it's still going to be up to Detective Lucy, the group engagement partner, to determine the appropriate opinion based on all the information that they now have.